Everyone laughed when Marissa inherited nothing but a rotting shack in the Colorado hills. Family called it worthless. Neighbors said it was better suited for firewood, and developers circled like vultures, offering her pennies just to be rid of it. But beneath the sagging roof and condemned boards lay a secret no one imagined. A hidden vault of tunnels, journals from the 1800s, and veins of gold sealed away by men who swore it was too dangerous to claim. Was this ruin truly a curse of greed, or the greatest inheritance ever concealed? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope, with nothing to suggest that its contents would change her life. Marissa Turner held it in her hands with the hesitation of someone used to bills and overdue notices rather than gifts or good fortune. She sat at the small kitchen table of her one-bedroom apartment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Her fingertips brushed the embossed seal of a law office in Denver, and her heart gave a quick, nervous beat. For years, she had lived from paycheck to paycheck, her job at the hardware store barely covering rent and groceries. Inheritance was a word she associated with other people. Families with wealth, sprawling estates, jewelry locked in safe deposit boxes. It was not a word that belonged to her. She unfolded the papers slowly, eyes scanning the stiff legal language until a single sentence leapt out. You are the sole beneficiary of the estate of Ruth Eleanor Hensley. The name brought her up short. Aunt Ruth, the reclusive great-aunt she had met only once at a family reunion when she was a child, a woman who lived alone in the mountains of Colorado, far removed from the rest of the family. The memory was vague. Ruth in a faded dress, her hair pulled back, watching quietly from the edges of the gathering. Marissa's mother had spoken of her sparingly, calling her eccentric, stubborn, and impossible to live with. And now, Ruth was gone, leaving behind what the letter described as a parcel of land and a residential structure. Marissa let the papers rest on the table, staring at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something more practical. A residential structure. The phrase was deliberately vague. She imagined a cabin, maybe a small cottage tucked among the pines. For a moment, a flicker of hope stirred. Perhaps this was a stroke of luck she had been waiting for. Something to lift her out of the narrow life she had been trapped in since the divorce, since the debts piled higher than her paychecks could ever reach. The following week, she made the trip to rural Clear Creek County, driving her dented sedan along winding roads that grew narrower with each mile. The mountains rose higher around her, their peaks dusted with late spring snow. She passed small towns where gas stations doubled as diners, and the same handful of trucks lined Main Street every day. The directions eventually led her onto a gravel road flanked by aspens, their leaves trembling in the mountain wind. When she turned the final bend, she saw the structure that was now hers. It was no cabin. The shack squatted at the edge of a clearing, its roof sagging in the middle, as though the weight of years had pressed it down. The windows were patched with cardboard, one corner of the foundation crumbling where weeds had pushed through. Rust streaked the sheet metal siding, and the porch, if it could be called that, leaned so badly it looked moments away from collapse. A condemned notice flapped against the doorframe, nailed there by the county. She killed the engine and sat in silence, the air around her thin and sharp with the smell of pine. This was what Aunt Ruth had left her, a shack that looked ready to surrender to the next strong wind. She could already hear her cousins' laughter if they knew Marissa, who could never catch a break, inheriting nothing but a pile of kindling. Still, when she stepped out of the car, a strange pull tugged at her chest. She walked slowly toward the shack, boots crunching on gravel, and placed her hand against the weathered door. The wood was rough, scarred by decades of storms, yet held firm beneath her touch. For all its ruin, it stood. That counted for something. And though she didn't know why, she felt the certainty that this place, worthless to everyone else, had been left to her for a reason. When word spread that Marissa had inherited the shack, it seemed to travel faster than she could have imagined. She hadn't told many people, just her cousin on the phone and a coworker who asked why she had requested time off. But in a small family and in a community where news moved quicker than the mail, secrets had no place to hide. By the time she returned from her first visit to property, her relatives had already formed their opinions. and they were not shy about sharing them. Her brother called first. He lived 2 states away, but carried the same tone he had used since they were children, the kind that managed to sound both mocking and concerned. "A shack in the mountains?" He laughed, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Marissa, you should have signed it over before you even saw it. Those things aren't homes. They're fire hazards. If it hasn't already fallen in on itself, it's probably crawling with animals. You'll waste money just trying to keep the roof on. Sell it for firewood, and put whatever pennies you get into something useful." Their aunt chimed in next, during a Sunday dinner at her parents' house. The table, crowded with cousins and in-laws, became a stage for commentary. "It's just like Ruth," the older woman said, shaking her head. "She always did things a hard way, and now she's passed that curse on to Marissa. That shack isn't worth the gas it takes to drive there." Someone else added that the county would probably fine her if she tried to keep it. Laughter rose around the table, half-hearted jokes about her turning the land into a bonfire or charging tourists to see the world's ugliest cabin. Marissa sat quietly, her fork untouched, feeling the weight of their voices pressing down. The neighbors in her apartment building weren't much kinder when they heard. One leaned against the stairwell railing, grinning as though it were all a joke. "A free shack? That's like winning a free bag of trash. Congratulations, I guess. Just make sure you don't sink money into it. You're better off letting the county tear it down." Another suggested she could strip it for scrap metal, maybe earn enough for a few tanks of gas. Their laughter echoed in her ears long after conversations ended, their certainty hammering against the small, unsteady spark of hope she had carried home from her first visit. What stung most wasn't their dismissal of the shack itself, but the ease with which they dismissed her. She could hear it between their words, an old and familiar note. Marissa always choosing wrong, always clinging to things that didn't make sense. They had said it when she married too young, when she stayed after the marriage collapsed, when she kept a job that never paid enough. Now, inheriting a shack became another symbol of her poor judgment in their eyes. But each time she replayed their laughter, she remembered how she had felt standing before the shack with her hand pressed against the weathered door. Yes, it was broken. Yes, it looked ready to fall. But beneath the ruin there had been something else. Something she couldn't quite name, a sense of weight, of history, of presence. If everyone else saw only a pile would fit for the fire, she wondered why she had felt that quiet pull, that insistence that it mattered. That night, alone in her apartment, she spread the deed and the letter across her table again. Their laughter echoed in her mind, but she refused to let it drown out the memory of the shack standing stubbornly against the wind. Whatever the others believed, she decided she would not give up so easily, if nothing else. She wanted to know why Ruth had chosen her, of all people, to inherit a place everyone else thought worthless. That answer, she felt, could not be found in a quick sale or a demolition order. It had to be discovered step by step, inside the walls of the shack itself. The gravel crunched beneath her tires as Marissa eased her sedan to a stop at the edge of the clearing. For a long moment, she simply sat behind the wheel, staring through the windshield at the structure that was now hers. The shack looked even worse in daylight than it had in her memory from that first hurried visit. In the morning sun, every floor revealed itself with cruel clarity. The roof bowed in the middle like a tired spine. Shingles long gone and replaced haphazardly with sheets of rusted tin that rattled with each gust of wind. The porch slanted so severely that one leg of the railing no longer touched the ground, leaving it suspended in air like an unfinished thought. She stepped out, the mountain air sharp in her lungs, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Her boot sank slightly into the uneven soil, where tufts of grass and weeds grew in stubborn patches. The yard had been overtaken by wild growth, waist-high in some places, tangled with briars and thistles. Empty bottles and rusted cans half buried in the dirt suggested years of neglect, as though the place had been forgotten by everyone except the wind and the birds that nested in the trees. Walking closer, she noticed the windows first. The glass was shattered in most of them, jagged shards still clinging to their frames like broken teeth. Where panes had fallen out entirely, cardboard and plywood had been nailed clumsily into place, though time and rain had warped them until they hung loose. The door bore the scars of weather. The paint peeled away to reveal splintered wood beneath. Someone had scrawled a warning across it in faded spray paint. keep out, but the words had long since been softened by the elements. The foundation was no better. She crouched down to study one corner, where the boards pulled away from their supports, revealing gaps large enough for small animals to crawl through. From the size of the holes and the scattered droppings, she guessed raccoons or skunks had already made the place their own. Near the back, a tree root had pushed under the structure, lifting part of it several inches and tilting the entire shack at a noticeable angle. It was a wonder the building still stood at all. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of dust, mold, and wood left to rot. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating motes that swirled lazily as she stepped onto the warped floorboards. They groaned under her weight, soft in places where rain had seeped through. The walls bore layers of faded wallpaper, peeling to reveal older patterns beneath. Roses giving way to stripes, stripes to plain wood, a history of occupants written in decoration and decay. A cast-iron stove sat rusting in one corner, its door hanging open, the ashes inside long since turned to damp clumps. She ran her hand along the wall, feeling the texture of cracked plaster beneath her fingertips. There was a strange intimacy in touching the ruin, as though the house carried the memory of everyone who had ever lived here. She tried to imagine Ruth in these rooms, what she had cooked, where she had sat during long winters, how she kept the world at bay in a place so stark and lonely. Standing in the middle of the single main room, Marissa felt both overwhelmed and strangely grounded. The shack was undeniably broken, almost beyond repair, yet it possessed a stubbornness that matched her own. It had endured storms, neglect, and the creeping advance of weeds, and still remained upright, defying the certainty of collapse. She drew in a slow breath, the mountain air mixing with the musk of old wood, and felt that same inexplicable pull she had felt before. This was no prize, no windfall that anyone else would call fortune. But as she looked around, she knew she could not dismiss it as worthless. There was something here that asked to be seen more closely, something that waited beneath the ruin. And despite the laughter of her family and the warnings of neighbors, Marissa felt certain that she was meant to uncover it. The first time she allowed herself to step fully inside, Marissa carried nothing more than a flashlight and a notebook. As if by documenting what she saw, she could make sense of the ruin. The air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood, and something faintly metallic like rust. Dust clung to every surface, muting colors, softening edges, turning the interior into a muted palette of grays and browns. She stood in silence for a long while, the beam of her flashlight sweeping across the room, before she noticed the details that revealed this place had once been more than just a shack. Near the stove lay a scatter of dishes, stacked haphazardly in a wooden crate. Most were chipped enamelware, the kind sold cheaply in the 1940s or 50s, edges rimmed in faded blue. A cracked mug still bore the faint outline of a red flower, rubbed smooth by decades of use. Beside them, a spoon with its handle bent out of shape rested in a layer of dust, so thick it looked fossilized. She picked it up, rubbing the tarnish away with her sleeve, and wondered who had last used it. Someone stirring a pot of beans, perhaps, or scraping the last of the meal from the pan. Against the far wall stood what remained of a cot, its frame rusted and mattress long gone, though tufts of stuffing clung stubbornly to the wires. A wool blanket lay crumpled on the floor, so stiff with age it seemed to become part of the boards beneath. She crouched to touch it, and the fabric disintegrated under her fingers, leaving her with strands of coarse fiber that drifted away on the air. She moved deeper, her light catching on paper scattered across a small table in the corner. Most were ruined beyond recognition, edges curled and blackened from moisture, but one sheet held faint legible handwriting. The ink had bled and faded, but she could still make out a name, Ruth. The letters curved delicately, almost hesitant. Marissa felt a jolt at the recognition. Her aunt's hand, preserved here in a fragment of ordinary life. A grocery list, perhaps, or a note that never reached its intended recipient. She carefully folded the fragile paper, tucking it into her notebook before the air could claim it. There were shoes by the door, worn leather cracked wide open, their soles nearly gone. She imagined them trudging through mud, through snow, carrying someone to and from the mines that dotted these mountains. Nearby, a kerosene lantern rested on a shelf, its glass blackened with soot. A few books slumped beside it, their covers curled and pages eaten by damp, but titles still visible. An almanac from 1912, a hymnal missing its spine, a slim volume of poetry that made her pause. She ran her thumb across the brittle cover, reading words that someone in the shack must have once read aloud in the long winter evenings. As her flashlight passed across the ceiling, she noticed something carved into one of the beams. At first, she thought it was just scratches from tools, but when she leaned closer, she saw deliberate marks, initials cut deep into the wood. R.E.H. Ruth Eleanor Hensley. The letters were steady, carved with intention, claiming the space as her own. Marissa reached up, pressing her fingers against the grooves, and felt a strange connection to the woman she had barely known. Everywhere she looked, the room whispered of lives that had passed quietly and without recognition. There were no heirlooms here, no treasures for greedy relatives to fight over. Only the remains of days lived in obscurity. Yet those scraps, shoes, spoons, books, initials, spoke with more force than anything her family's laughter could diminish. This shack was not empty. It was full of echoes, lingering traces of endurance, of someone who had carved out an existence when the world offered little. By the time she stepped back outside into the fading light, Marissa's clothes carried the smell of dust and old smoke. She brushed herself off, but the weight of what she had seen clung to her more firmly. The shack had revealed its first secret. It was not worthless, not just rotting boards and sagging roof lines. It was a vessel of memory. And for reasons she could not yet explain, those memories had been left in her care. Marissa returned to the shack 2 mornings later with a small bag of tools she had borrowed from a hardware store. She carried no illusions that she could fix much, but the thought of letting the place collapse without trying felt unbearable. The drive had been quiet, the mountain roads winding through early summer light, yet her stomach stayed tight, as if she expected bad news waiting for her. When she stepped out of the car, she saw it immediately. A bright orange sign nailed to the door, its edges curling, but the message printed in bold block letters that could not be mistaken. Condemned. She walked closer, the crunch of gravel loud in the stillness. Below the warning in large type, smaller print explained the details in bureaucratic language. Structural instability, hazard to occupants, unsafe foundation, violations of county code. She read every line as if reading them twice might change a verdict. At the bottom, a date was printed. 30 days from now. That was the deadline. Either she repaired the shack to meet the county's requirements, or the building would be torn down, and with it her claim to the land would dissolve into fines and legal complications. For a long time she stood with her hands on her hips, staring at the orange paper. It reminded her of eviction notices she had once received during the hardest years after her divorce, the same sense of humiliation mixed with dread. She imagined her family laughing when they heard. "See," they would say, "asterisk, even the county knows it's worthless. It'll cost more to save it than the land is worth. Sell it now before it drags you under. Asterisk." She walked around the shack, studying it with a new urgency. The roof sagged in the middle where beams had rotted through. The porch leaned dangerously. One more season of snow might snap it off entirely. At the base, she noticed new cracked spiderwebbing across the foundation stones. She crouched to touch them, her fingers coming away dusty with chalky grit. To the county inspector, these details were proof of failure. But to her, they were a challenge. Marissa sank down onto the steps, if they could still be called steps, and let her eyes wander across the yard. The weed swayed gently in the breeze. A raven perched on the roofline, tilting its head as though curious about her. The shack looked every bit as broken as the sign declared, yet she couldn't bring herself to believe it deserved destruction. There was something here. She felt in the quiet pull every time she touched its walls or uncovered a remnant of Ruth's life. This place mattered, though the proof of that meaning remained hidden. She pulled the sign gently from a nail and folded it into her bag. She knew the county had copies and records, but she could not stand to leave it plastered across the doorway like a scarlet letter. The shack deserved at least that small dignity. Rising again, she made herself a promise. She had 30 days. 30 days to prove to herself, to the county, to anyone watching, that this was more than firewood and rubble. She would patch what she could, study what she could not, and search for a reason her aunt had chosen her, and not any of the others, to inherit this place. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the shack cast long shadows across the clearing. Marissa placed her hand against the door once more, feeling the grooves of weatherwood beneath her palm. The county had called it condemned, but she refused to call it finished. This place still had something to say, and she was determined to hear it before the 30 days were gone. The air inside the shack felt different that morning, as though the place itself had been waiting for her to return. Marissa carried a crowbar and a lantern, her resolve sharpened by the memory of the orange condemned notice. 30 days. That deadline lingered in her mind with every step she took. She knew she couldn't save the shack by brute force or money. She had neither the resources nor the skills for a complete restoration. But she had time, curiosity, and a stubborn refusal to surrender. That was enough to push her through the door again. The floor creaked beneath her weight as she crossed the room, dust motes swirling in the shaft of light pouring to the broken roof. She set the lantern down and tested the board with a crowbar, prying gently here and there, listening for the hollow thud that might betray something hidden below. At first it was nothing but the groan of wood and the occasional squeak of nails resisting. But then, near the corner by the stove, her tool slipped into a seam that seemed looser than the rest. She pressed down, and the board shifted slightly under her boot. Her pulse quickened. She knelt, wedging the crowbar deeper, and with a loud crack the plank lifted free. Beneath it lay darkness, the smell of old earth rising up. She lowered the lantern into the gap, its glow revealing a shallow cavity. At the bottom, half buried in dust and cobwebs, sat a small metal box, its surface mottled with rust. She hesitated, staring at it as though it might vanish if she moved too quickly. The box was no larger than a loaf of bread, the kind of container miners or farmers once used to hold valuables. She reached down, her fingers brushing the cool, gritty surface, and pulled it free. It was heavier than it looked. The rust flaked away in her hands, staining her skin with reddish powder. A thin padlock clung stubbornly to the latch, its metal fuse shut by time. She carried it to the table, set it down, and studied it in the dim light. It took several tries with the crowbar and the heel of her boot before the lock finally gave way, snapping with a brittle pop. The lid resisted, but when it finally creaked open, the smell of old paper and oil rose into the room. Inside were bundles of folded sheets, tied loosely with string, their edges brown and fragile. She lifted the first stack carefully, untying the cord with deliberate patience, afraid the slightest tug might tear them apart. The handwriting was faint but legible, ink faded to a brownish gray. Dates marked the tops of many pages, 1891, 1892, 1893. Some were ledger entries, lists of supplies purchased and tools ordered, with notes about shipments of timber and ore. Others read more like fragments of a diary, lines about weather, about setbacks in progress, about tunnels dug beneath the ridge. One entry caught her attention. Asterisk, the work slows, but the promise lies deeper. If the supports hold, we will reach the vein. Asterisk. Her hands trembled slightly as she read, the words painting images of men laboring beneath the mountain, striking rock with pickaxes, measuring their progress in sweat and danger. At the bottom of another page, someone had drawn a crude sketch, a tunnel branching into two directions, one marked with a cross. Marissa traced it with her fingertip, wondering if it represented something real beneath the shack, or just the imaginings of men who convinced themselves gold was close. She set the papers aside and peered deeper into the box. More sheets waited, some rolled tightly, others folded into envelopes. A few carried stains that might have been water, or perhaps blood. It was impossible to tell. She felt the weight of history pressing on her, the sense that these were not just scraps of forgotten life, but pieces of a puzzle her aunt must have known about. Closing the box, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling where sunlight streamed through a hole in the roof. She remembered the laughter of her family, the voices urging her to sell this place for nothing. They would never believe her if she told them what she had found. But in her hands lay proof that the shack was not worthless. It was a doorway, and these papers were the first key. Marissa returned to the shack the following afternoon with a thermos of coffee and gloves she had borrowed from the hardware store supply closet. She set herself at the table where the rusted lockbox still rested, the bundles of papers stacked carefully beside it. The late light slanted through the broken roof, catching the dust that hung in the air like a veil. She untied the second bundle with deliberate patience, easing the brittle pages apart. Some disintegrated at the edges as she moved them, leaving crumbs of paper that fluttered to the floor. Others held together more firmly. Their ink faded but still legible, as though someone had written them in haste and never imagined they would last more than a season. At first, she thought they were more lists, supplies, dates, small notes about wages paid. But as she flipped deeper, her eyes caught longer passages, the tone shifting from businesslike to personal. This wasn't just an account book. It was a journal, kept by someone who had lived and worked here more than a century ago. The name appeared on the inside cover, written in a steady, slanted hand. Thomas Avery. The entries began in 1889. He described arriving in Clear Creek County with 3 partners, men who had pooled their savings and staked a claim in the hills above the shack. "The ridge runs true," one line read, "and the quartz shows promise. We have marked the vein and will begin the first shaft tomorrow." Marissa traced the word with her finger, picturing men with calloused hands and dirt under their nails, driving tools into hard stone, chasing glitter hidden deep inside the mountain. The more she read, the more a rhythm revealed itself. The ledger was part account of labor, part confession. He noted when timbers were brought up the valley, when a mule had gone lame, when storms had driven them from the shaft for days. But between those practical lines slipped something else, fragments of unease. "The work slows," he wrote in September of 1890, "not for lack of will, but for lack of trust. Men quarrel over shares not yet earned. The mountain tests us, and I fear greed will undo what sweat has built." Marissa felt a chill as she read the words aloud, her voice echoing in the empty shack. The entries painted a picture of men bound together by hope, yet divided by suspicion. There were references to maps hidden, to marks carved into beams, to symbols only the rightful man would understand. One page in particular stopped her. The ink had blotted at the edges, but the message was clear. "The vein lies deeper still. We cannot finish. Should the claim pass to others, may they read these lines and continue what we began." She leaned back, the journal heavy in her hands. Her aunt must have known this was here. Ruth had kept the shack standing long after most would have abandoned it. Perhaps she had found the box herself and chosen not to disturb it, leaving the responsibility to someone else. And now that someone else was her. Outside, the wind rushed through the trees, rattling the broken panes like faint applause or warning. Marissa closed the ledger carefully, setting it aside as though it were something sacred. This was no longer just a condemned shack. It was a doorway into unfinished work, into lives that had cut into mountain and left their hopes buried there. She felt the pull again, stronger than before. Somewhere beneath her feet, something waited. And the words of Thomas Avery suggested it was not just gold they had left behind, but a story that demanded to be uncovered. Marissa had returned to the shack with the miner's ledger tucked securely into her bag, as if carrying it might keep her tethered to men whose voices whispered through its faded ink. She moved cautiously through the dim interior, her eyes drifting from page to wall, searching for any sign that the markings Avery described might still exist. The floor groaned under her steps, and the light slanted in jagged strips through holes in the roof, catching dust motes that spun in lazy spirals. For a long while she saw nothing beyond a familiar ruin. The cracked plaster, the sagging boards, the faint stains that had seeped into the wood over decades of neglect. But then her gaze fell toward the beams near the foundation, and something shifted. She crouched low, brushing away a curtain of cobwebs and loose dirt that clung to the wood. There, cut into the grain, were lines that did not belong to any accident of weather or rot. They were deliberate. At first they seemed random, short grooves, triangles, circles overlapping one another. But as she leaned closer, she saw patterns. The grooves repeated, almost rhythmic, as though someone had been careful to carve a message rather than idle scratches. The initials she found earlier, Ruth's hand pressed into the timber, had been shallow, almost gentle. These cuts were deeper, more insistent, etched with the determination of someone who expected them to last. She pulled the ledger from her bag, flipping back to the entries where Avery had written of marks cut for those who would follow. Her heart beat faster as she compared the sketches in the margins, rough compass points, angular designs, with what lay before her. They were not identical, but close enough that she felt certain she was seeing the same language across a gulf of more than a century. Running her fingertips along the grooves, she felt the sharpness still present in their edges. Whoever had made them had cut deeply, as though they understood that time and weather would fight to erase the message. The wood had darkened around the carvings, but the lines remained firm. She traced one symbol that looked like a crude star, its points uneven yet purposeful. Another resembled a box with a line running diagonally through it. A code, perhaps, or markers pointing to something hidden. As she studied the beams, she noticed more of the carving scattered in places easily overlooked. Behind support near the stove, half buried under a plank by the wall, carved faintly into the joist just above head level. They seemed to form no clear sequence. Yet their presence multiplied the longer she searched, until it felt as though the shack itself was stitched together by these silent signs. Marissa's breath caught at the thought. This was no accidental shelter, no crude miner's cabin thrown together for a season and abandoned. It had been designed to carry a message, to preserve something. Her aunt must have known, or at least suspected. For why else would Ruth keep this place standing when everyone else dismissed it as worthless? She rose to her feet, brushing the dust from her palms, and stood in the middle of the room. Around her, the carvings seemed to stare back, silent and insistent. She imagined Avery and his partners, bent over these beams with knives or chisels, working by lantern light, marking symbols that only they understood. Were they warnings? Directions? Claims staked in secret? She opened the ledger again, whispering one of the lines into the hollow air. Asterisk, should the claim pass to others, may they read these lines and continue what we began. Asterisk, for the first time since inheriting the shack, Marissa felt she was no longer standing in ruin. She was standing in a map, or the beginnings of one, its details scattered in carvings and faded ink. The condemned notice still burned at the back of her mind, the threat of demolition looming closer with each day. But as she pressed her hand against one of the carved beams, she realized she could not let the county erase this place. The shack was not just her inheritance. It was a cipher, and she was beginning to learn its language. Marissa had begun to spend her evenings on the porch of the shack, sitting on its crooked steps with a notebook balanced on her knee. The pages of Thomas Avery's ledger lay open beside her, weighted with a stone to keep them from blowing away in the mountain wind. She would copy the strange symbols she found carved into beams, sketching them carefully, comparing them against the faded drawings in the margins of the old journal. Most nights the only sounds were the rustle of aspens and the distant call of a bird, but one evening the crunch of boots on gravel pulled her attention up the road. An older man was making his way toward her, steady despite the slope, his hat brim pulled low against the sun. He carried himself with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from years of working the land. Marissa rose as he approached, brushing the dust from her jeans. He stopped a few paces away, his gaze lingering on the shack before settling on her. "Name's Frank Dillard," he said, tipping his hat in a polite gesture. "My place is just down the valley. Thought I'd introduce myself, since I hear you're the new owner of Ruth's place." Marissa nodded, still adjusting to the idea of being called an owner. "I'm Marissa Turner. I inherited it from my aunt." "Ruth was a stubborn one," Frank said, his voice slow, each word measured. "Kept to herself. Folks around here always wondered why she held on to this shack when she had offers to sell. She must have seen something the rest of us didn't." Marissa hesitated before asking, "Did you ever hear anything about this place? About who lived here before her?" The rancher's eyes narrowed slightly, as though weighing whether to speak. Then he shifted his stance, leaning on the fence post by the yard. "There have been stories. This valley's full of them. Back in the late 1800s, prospectors swarmed these hills. Some made fortunes, most didn't. Folks say there were mines cut under half the ridges around here. Some official, some not. Men chasing veins that petered out or hiding their finds from claim jumpers. I remember my grandfather talking about tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the mountains. Dangerous places. More than one man went in and didn't come back." Marissa listened closely, her fingers tightening around the edge of her notebook. She thought of the ledger, of Avery's words about unfinished work. "Do you think there's one under here?" she asked quietly. Frank studied the shack for a long time, his gaze moving across the sagging roof, The leaning porch, the way the structure sat awkwardly on the land. Wouldn't surprise me. Shack like this doesn't stand this long, without a reason. Some say there's an abandoned system of tunnels under this stretch of the valley. My grandfather claimed he saw smoke once, rising from cracks in the ground after a storm. Said it was from fires burning deep underground, left by miners who'd sealed themselves in. Could be nothing more than old tales, but his voice trailed off, leaving the weight of suggestion hanging in the air. Marissa felt the hairs on her arms rise despite the warmth of the evening. She looked back at the shack, remembering the carvings, the journal's map sketched in hurried lines. If there are tunnels, she asked, why hasn't anyone found them? Frank gave a thin smile. Because some places don't want to be found, and because most folks gave up looking once the big mines dried out. People moved on, but the mountain doesn't forget. If there's something under your feet, it's been waiting a long time. He tipped his hat again and began his slow walk back down the road, leaving Marissa standing in the growing shadows. The sound of his boots faded, replaced by the rustling of the aspens, the steady breath of the valley. She turned back to the shack, its windows dark and hollow, its beams lined with symbols she had only begun to understand. If the old rancher's warning held truth, the shack was more than a ruin. It was a doorway to whatever lay hidden beneath the mountain, abandoned but not forgotten. And for the first time, she understood why her aunt had kept it when everyone else insisted it was worthless. The day began with a steady rhythm of small tasks. Marissa had decided to clear out some of the debris that had collected inside the shack over the years. Splintered boards, rusted tins, heaps of broken glass half buried in dust. She worked with a broom and a bucket, her sleeves rolled up, the thin light streaming through the holes in the roof, catching on the motes that swirled around her. Each sweep of the broom revealed more of the warped floorboards beneath, their surfaces gray and swollen from years of water seeping through. By midday, sweat dampened her back, despite the cool mountain air. She paused near the corner by the stove, where the boards had always looked more uneven than elsewhere. Something about that spot unsettled her. When she stepped across it earlier, the wood gave under her weight with an uneasy groan. Now, as she stooped to push aside a pile of rotted planks, she heard the faint sound of cracking. She froze, the broom still in her hands, her breath caught in her chest. Then it happened. With a sharp, splintering crack, the section of floor gave way. Boards snapped like brittle bones, falling into darkness below. Dust rose in a choking cloud as debris tumbled into the void. Marissa staggered backward, clutching the broom handle like a lifeline, her heart hammering. For several moments, she could do nothing but cough and wave the air clear, her eyes stinging from the sudden burst of dirt and ash. When the dust settled enough for her to see, she crept forward cautiously, her boots crunching on the jagged edge of the broken floor. A hole had opened where the boards had collapsed, wide enough to reveal something that should not have been there. Below the shack's foundation yawned a space larger than she had imagined, dark, deep, and silent. She lowered herself to her knees, peering into the opening. At first she saw nothing but shadow. Then, as her eyes adjusted, faint outlines emerged. Beams of rough-hewn timber propping up the walls of tunnel, their surfaces dark with age. She could make out the faint glimmer of rusted metal, what looked like a rail or a pipe vanishing into the darkness. The air rising from the void was cool and damp, carried with it the sharp tang of stone and something older, something that smelled of earth long undisturbed. Her pulse quickened as she remembered the rancher's words, the stories of abandoned mines beneath the valley. This was no cellar, no shallow crawl space beneath a shack. This was a passage, a tunnel cut by hands that had vanished more than a century ago. She reached for the lantern she had set on the table earlier, lit it with trembling fingers, and lowered it carefully into the hole. The light spilled downward, illuminating timber supports blackened by time and rock walls that glistened faintly in the glow. The tunnel stretched beyond the lantern's reach, swallowing the light with its depth. For a moment she thought she saw movement, but it was only the shifting of shadows across uneven stone. Marissa sat back on her heels, gripping the edge of the broken boards to steady herself. The collapse had uncovered what the ledger and carvings had only hinted at. There was something beneath the shack, hidden for decades, waiting to be found. She thought of her family's laughter, their certainty that the place was worthless. and felt a spark of indication stir in her chest. This was no ruin to be burned or torn down. This was an entrance, a threshold into the unfinished work Avery had described. The shack creaked above her, its broken frame groaning, as though it knew a secret had been revealed. She closed her eyes for a moment, drawing the cool air, steadying herself against the rush of fear and exhilaration. Then she opened them again and stared into the dark void, knowing the next step would be to go down. The morning after the floor gave way, Marissa returned with a stronger lantern and a length of rope coiled over her shoulder. She hadn't slept much, her mind replaying the sound of the board snapping, the sudden glimpse of that hollow space yawning beneath her feet. It was impossible to ignore now. Whatever lay beneath the shack was real, no longer just the stuff of rumors or faded journal entries. She swept aside the remaining splinters, widening the opening just enough to lean over it safely. The lantern's light slid down into the shadows, catching on the rough timber beams that lined the walls below. And there, tucked against one side of the void, she saw it, wooden rungs nailed into two vertical poles, descending into the earth. At first she thought it was just a remnant of framing, but as she tilted the lantern farther, she realized it was unmistakably a ladder. Its rails were thick but warped with age, the rungs uneven, some cracked clean through. She could imagine men climbing it by lantern light, boots slipping on damp wood, descending into the tunnels with pickaxes over their shoulders. Her heart pounded as she crouched lower, testing the top rung with the end of her broom. The wood sagged but held, though a flake of rot fell away into the blackness. She drew back, weighing the danger. The ladder might still bear her weight, or it might crumble halfway down. She pictured herself falling into the void, lantern shattered, darkness swallowing her whole. For several minutes she sat cross-legged beside the hole, chewing her lip, the decision pressing against her chest like a stone. She set the rope aside and lowered the lantern once more, studying what she could of the tunnel. The ladder disappeared into the shadows, but she could see just enough to know the shaft was not too deep. Perhaps 15 feet at most before it opened onto solid ground. That knowledge steadied her. She tied the rope around one of the shack's upright beams, pulling it tight until the knots bit into the wood. Even if the ladder betrayed her, she would have something to cling to. She tested the first rung with her boot, then another. Each groaned under her weight, the sound echoing upward into the hollow shack. Dust rained down as she moved carefully, one hand on the rope, the other clutching the lantern. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Step by step she descended, the smell of damp stone and rusted iron growing stronger with each breath. Halfway down, a rung splintered under her foot, jerking her body forward. But she caught herself with the rope, hard hammering as the shard clattered into the darkness below. She pressed her forehead against the ladder, breathing hard until the tremor passed. When at last her boots touched solid ground, she lowered the lantern and turned in a slow circle. The tunnel stretched ahead, timber supports leaning like weary sentinels, their surfaces blackened with age. A narrow rail glimmered faintly in the dust, the remains an old mine track disappearing into shadow. The air was cold, carrying the scent of stone and something faintly metallic, like pennies held too long in a palm. She looked back up toward a jagged hole above, light streaming down in broken shafts, the shack's crooked frame silhouetted against the sky. It seemed impossibly far now, a different world above her. Down here, the silence was thick, pressing on all sides, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the earth. She held the lantern higher, its glow revealing the faint outline of boot prints hardened in the dust, relics of men who had once walked this same path more than a century ago. Marissa stood still, gripping the lantern, her fear balanced by a sharp pull of wonder. The ladder had carried her not just into a tunnel, but into the life Avery had recorded in his ledger, unfinished work carved into the bones of the mountain. Whatever waited in the darkness ahead was the inheritance no one else had wanted, and she realized now she could not turn back. The lantern cast a trembling circle of light as Marissa moved forward, its glow catching on the rough stone walls that closed in around her. The tunnel was narrow, no wider than a hallway, and the timber supports that held the earth in place leaned at odd angles, their surfaces scarred by axes and pick marks. Some beams were still sturdy, wedged tightly against the ceiling, but others had begun to rot at the base, their edges crumbling into the dust. She ducked beneath one that had sagged so low she could feel the rough grain of which scraped the top of her jacket. Each step stirred a cloud of fine dirt that floated lazily in the air before settling again in silence. She stopped often, her ears straining for any sound beyond her own breath. The quiet of the tunnel felt unnatural, as though the world above had been sealed away and replaced with a hollowed-out stillness. In that silence, the smallest noises became amplified, the creak of her boots against stone, the faint drip of water echoing somewhere deeper, the hiss of the lantern flame as it flared against the draft. She told herself to breathe evenly, to keep moving, to focus on the details instead of the press of fear against her ribs. Her eyes caught on the first abandoned tool near the wall. It was a pickaxe. Its wooden handle split and blackened with age, the metal head rusted to a dull red. She crouched beside it, brushing the dust away, and for a moment she could almost see the man who had last swung it, sweat running down his face as he struck into the rock, hopeful for a glint of gold that never came. A little farther on, she found a shovel leaning against the timber, its blade dented and worn thin from years of scraping stone. The rail she had glimpsed from above ran unbroken along the center of the tunnel, a pair of rusted tracks that curved gently with the passage. At one point she came upon a mine cart, still sitting crookedly on the rails, its sides dented, one wheel locked at an angle. Inside lay a heap of rocks streaked faintly with white quartz, as though the miners had abandoned it mid-shift and never returned to haul it out. She touched the rim of the cart, her fingers coming away stained with rust, and felt the weight of time pressing down on everything around her. She lifted the lantern higher and saw marks cut into the walls, tool strikes that formed shallow grooves across the stone, evidence of hours of labor etched permanently into the mountain. On one wall, someone had carved initials into the rock, half hidden under soot. She traced them with her fingertips, wondering if they belonged to Thomas Avery himself or one of the other men whose names had vanished into the silence of the years. The tunnel bent slightly to the right, and as she rounded the corner, the air grew cooler, damper. Drops of water clung to the ceiling, falling occasionally onto her shoulders. She tilted the lantern upward and saw that the timber supports here were darker, coated in a sheen of moisture, their bases sinking into soft mud. A cracked helmet lay half buried in the muck, its leather strap still buckled as though waiting for its owner to return. Marissa paused, her throat tight, and set the lantern down on a rock to steady her hands. She let the glow stretch into the shadows, illuminating the tunnel as far as it could reach. Every object she had passed, every tool, every mark, spoke of lives that had pressed forward into the same darkness, driven by hunger or desperation, leaving behind fragments of themselves for her to discover. She realized then that she was not just walking through a tunnel, but through a history buried and forgotten, a story that had been sealed away beneath her aunt's shack until fate had cracked the boards open. With a deep breath, she picked up the lantern again and continued forward, the sound of her steps mingling with the steady drip of water, the silence swallowing her as the tunnel stretched farther into the unknown. Marissa slowed her pace as the tunnel widened, the lantern's glow spreading farther across the uneven floor. For a while, her eyes registered only the scatter of loose stones and the grooves left by the rusted cart wheels. Then, just beyond the edge of light, she noticed depressions in the dust. At first she thought they were nothing more than natural indentations, the uneven settling of earth. But when she lowered the lantern closer, her breath caught. They were prints, the unmistakable shape of boots pressed into the fine gray powder that carpeted the ground. She crouched down, heart thudding, and traced the outline with her gloved hand. The print was broad, the heels square, the edges softened by time. A dozen others stretched ahead, weaving in and out of the shadows. They overlapped, some faint and shallow, others more distinct, as though made in different seasons of the mine's life. She followed them slowly, lantern raised, the air feeling heavier with each step. These were not her marks. They had been here long before her, pressed into the earth by men who had once worked these tunnels and then vanished, leaving nothing but their footprints to prove they had passed through. The dust had preserved them like a ledger of movement. Some turned abruptly, circling near the walls as though the man had inspected the supports or stopped to rest. Others moved in a straight line deeper into the shaft, steady and purposeful. Marissa tried to imagine their owners. Were they Avery and his partners? carrying lanterns like hers, voices low as they spoke of veins of gold, or had others come after? Strangers lured by whispers of abandoned claims and hidden wealth? She held the lantern lower, noting the subtle differences between the impressions. One pair looked smaller than the rest, the heel narrower, as though belonging to a younger man or someone with a lighter build. Another set dragged slightly at the toes, marking a gait that suggested fatigue or injury. Together they formed a silent procession, a frozen memory of men walking into the earth, unaware that time would swallow them whole. Marissa's own boots left fresh imprints alongside them, darker, more sharply defined. She glanced back at the trail she had made from the ladder to the spot and felt a strange kinship with the marks that had come before. She was walking the same path, separated by more than 100 years, yet connected by the same weight of curiosity and need. The thought sent a shiver through her. These men had left no treasure on the surface, no monuments, only their steps. And now she was following them into the unknown. As she pressed deeper, she noticed how abruptly some of the prints ended. A line of them veered toward the wall and stopped, as though the man had vanished mid-stride. Another set led to a collapsed section where a rock had fallen in thick slabs, sealing whatever lay beyond. She lingered there, studying the last visible print at the edge of the rubble, its shape eerily clear. Whoever had stood there had been the last to pass before the mountain closed away. The lantern's flame flickered in a draft, pulling her from her thoughts. She straightened, adjusting her grip on the handle, and took a deep breath of the cool, damp air. The prints were not just marks in the dust. They were evidence, proof that others had sought what she was now chasing, proof that the mine had once lived with human footsteps, and perhaps that it had claimed them in silence. Marissa continued forward, careful not to disturb the older impressions more than she already had. Each one felt like a message left for her alone, reminding her that though the shack above was derided as worthless, the earth beneath had carried secrets worth pursuing. She raised the lantern higher and followed the fading trail of boot prints deeper into the darkness, toward whatever story the mountain had yet to reveal. The tunnel narrowed again, the air turning colder as Marissa pressed forward with the lantern held high. The sound of her footsteps echoed strangely, bouncing back from stone walls that seemed to lean closer with each step. The rail she'd been following glinted faintly beneath the dust, two thin iron lines stretching ahead into the darkness. She kept her eyes on them, the way a traveler might follow a road, until the light finally revealed a shape hunched in their path. At first it was only a shadow, something bulky and uneven. Then the lantern's glow caught the hard edges of metal, and she saw it clearly, an old mine cart, still perched on the rails, as if waiting for men who would never return. She approached slowly, her heart tightened with a mixture of awe and unease. The cart was larger than she expected, its iron sides thick but mottled with rust. One of its wheels had slipped slightly off the track, locking at an angle, but otherwise it looked frozen mid-motion, abandoned in haste. She crouched beside it, brushing her hand along the rim. Rust crumbled under her fingertips, leaving streaks of red on her gloves. The lantern's light revealed the interior. Piles of rock fragments streaked with white veins, quartz flecked faintly with gold. Her breath caught at the sight. Even in this dim glow, the stone shimmered, muted but unmistakable. The thought struck her sharply. If these fragments had been left behind, what had the miners been chasing deeper in? They had filled this cart, pushed it along the rails, and then stopped, abandoning their work as if called away in an instant. She imagined the men straining at the handles, their boots grinding into the dust, voices low and urgent as they drove the cart forward. Something had interrupted them. Perhaps the collapse she had seen farther back, or perhaps something less tangible, some disagreement that split their unity. Marissa leaned closer, lifting a handful of the stone. It was heavier than she expected, its edges jagged. She turned it in her palm, the glint catching in the lantern's light. This was more than just rock. This was proof that the tunnel had once yielded something worth the labor. She set it back gently, her mind turned to Avery's words in the ledger. Unfinished work, a promise lying deeper. The cart seemed to embody that promise, halted yet not emptied, its load still resting as testimony to what they had found. The rails beneath her feet stretched on, disappearing into the shadowed throat of the tunnel. She tilted the lantern, trying to see how far they went, but the darkness swallowed the light. Still, the iron lines pulled at her vision, urging her to follow. She could almost feel the cart's weight shifting, as if it remembered the push of hands and longed to continue its journey. A strange shiver ran through her at the thought, and she stepped back, steadying herself against the wall. The silence was absolute. Only the faint hiss of the lantern flame filled the air, mingling with the slow drip of water somewhere unseen. Yet standing there before the cart, Marissa felt surrounded by the ghosts of movement, the prints she had followed. The tools scattered along the floor, and now this machine froze in mid-task. It all spoke of a rhythm that had once filled these tunnels. She felt the weight of it pressing in, as if the mountain itself remembered. She placed a hand on the rim of the cart one last time, grounding herself in the cool, corroded iron. Whatever had happened here, the men had not finished. Their work lay waiting, and now the rails invited her forward. She lifted the lantern higher, straightened her shoulders, and continued walking, the abandoned cart fading behind her as she stepped deeper into the passage, toward whatever the miners had left hidden in the shadows ahead. The tunnel pressed tighter the farther Marissa walked, the ceiling dipping low so that she had to hunch slightly to keep from striking her head against the beams. Her lantern threw uneven light across the walls, revealing layers of stone scarred by the blows of pickaxes. At first she saw only the familiar marks of labor: deep grooves, shallow chips, long strokes where tools had bitten into the rock. But as she slowed her pace, her eyes caught shapes that seemed too deliberate to be the byproduct of mining. The light skimmed over a cluster of lines that crossed in sharp angles, a design too precise to be accidental. She stepped closer, raising the lantern until it illuminated the section fully. There, carved into stone itself, were markings unlike any she had seen before. They were not initials, not random scratches. They formed patterns, circles intersecting with triangles, lines running parallel like rails, stars etched with uneven points. She ran her fingertips lightly over the grooves, feeling how deep they had been cut. The stone was worn smooth in places, as though time had softened it, but the symbols remained clear, preserved in the silence of the tunnel. Her breath quickened. She reached into her bag and pulled out Avery's ledger, flipping to the pages she had studied so many nights on the shack's crooked porch. In the margins, he had drawn rough sketches, small symbols whose purpose he had never explained. They were crude but recognizable. She held the lantern closer to the wall, comparing ink to stone, and felt her chest tighten. They matched: the star, the intersecting lines, even the square with a diagonal slash. The same hand that had written those words more than a century ago had etched its message here into the mountain's bones. The thought unsettled her. These weren't just notes left in a journal. They were instructions, perhaps, or warnings, carved into the earth itself, so they could not be lost to water or fire. She imagined Avery hunched against the wall, lantern at his side, pressing a chisel into the stone while her companions worked nearby. What had driven him to carve these here, hidden where no one might see them unless they pressed as deeply into the tunnel as she had? Marissa moved along the wall, the lantern revealing more symbols scattered in uneven intervals. Some were higher, nearly at shoulder height, others lower, etched closer to the floor. She crouched to examine one shape like an arrow pointing downward. The dust at its base stirred faintly in the draft, and she wondered if it marked a chamber below, something buried deeper than the eye could see. Her pulse quickened at the possibility. She whispered the words from the ledger, the line that had haunted her since she found it. Asterisk, should the claim pass to others, may they read these lines and continue what we began. Asterisk, the carvings were more than echoes. They were part of the continuation, a message meant to survive longer than paper. The miners had left behind a code, expecting anyone, to find it and pick up where they had stopped. And now that someone was her. The silence of the tunnel pressed close as she stood, her lantern flickering against the etched wall. The symbols seemed to shift in the light, as though inviting her to follow where they pointed. For the first time since she had stepped into the shack weeks ago, she felt certain of one thing. She had been led here not by accident, but by design. These marks were not relics. They were a map, one she was only beginning to decipher. Marissa sat on a flat stone in the tunnel, the lantern beside her casting its glow over the walls. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the ledger from her bag, balancing it across her knees. She had opened its pages countless times in the shack, but down here, beneath the earth, the words and drawings seemed to breathe with new weight. She flipped to the section where the sketches began in earnest, crude diagrams of branching lines, arrows, and symbols that had at first looked meaningless. By lantern light, with the stone walls close around her, they became something more. The page she lingered on showed a tunnel that forked into two directions. One branch was marked with a simple X, while the other carried a star like the one she had seen etched into the wall above her head only minutes earlier. Her pulse quickened. She stood and raised a lantern, sweeping along the passage until she saw it, an actual fork just a few yards away, one shaft leading left, the other veering sharply to the right. The stone at the corner was scarred by the familiar five-pointed carving. Her breath caught. She turned back to the page, studying Avery's hurried lines. It wasn't exact, not to scale, but the resemblance was undeniable. The map in the margins was not abstract doodling. It was this place, reduced to symbols that only someone carrying a ledger or the knowledge of what they meant could understand. She felt a chill even in the damp air. Avery had been writing not just for himself but for whoever might come after, leaving behind instructions that could survive when words failed. She moved slowly to the fork, lantern lifted high. The left-hand passage was partially collapsed, rocks wedged tightly into its frame, while the right remained open, its rails stretching deeper into darkness. She traced the star cut into the stone again, remembering how her fingers had fit into its grooves. The journal showed the same star at the branching path, as if Avery himself had stood exactly where she now stood, marking the way. Kneeling again, she turned the pages to another sketch. This one showed a square with a diagonal line, placed farther along a twisting path. She searched the ledger's notes for explanation, but Avery's words were spare. Mark place, one line read, "Vein beyond." Another, dated months later, carried a darker tone. "Supports failing. We cannot continue without risk. Yet the gold runs sure." Marissa pressed her lips together, her thoughts racing. If the map was accurate, and if the markings aligned with the tunnel itself, then somewhere deeper lay what they had pursued, a vein of gold abandoned not because it failed, but because they could not safely claim it. She closed the ledger gently, holding it against her chest for a moment before sliding it back into her bag. The carvings on the walls were no longer just strange relics to her. They were guideposts. The shack above, with its condemned sign and mocking reputation, had always been more than it seemed. Her aunt must have understood, at least in part, why it mattered. Ruth had preserved the shell of the house not out of stubbornness, but to protect what lay beneath, a map carved into stone and paper, waiting for someone willing to follow it. Marissa lifted the lantern and stepped closer to the right-hand shaft. The darkness ahead seemed denser, swallowing the light at its edges. She hesitated, one hand on the damp wall, her ears straining for any sound beyond the faint drip of water. She imagined Avery and his companion standing in this very spot, their faces lit by flickering flames, debating whether to continue or turn back. They had left their decision inscribed in ink and stone. Now the choice lay with her. As she took her first cautious step into the passage marked by the star, she felt the weight of the ledger like a living thing in her bag, urging her forward. The miners had left their map unfinished, their story suspended in half-dug shafts and coded drawings. But she could read it now, and though fear clawed at her with every breath, curiosity pulled harder. She was no longer just walking through a tunnel. She was walking through their intentions, their instructions, the very path they had drawn more than a century before. Marissa sat with her back against the damp wall, the ledger open on her lap, the lantern flickering beside her. The air in the tunnel felt heavier than before, as though the deeper she went, the more the mountain itself pressed down upon her. Her fingers turned the brittle pages with care, each one covered in scrawled notes that shifted between the mundane and the unsettling. Lists of timber and supplies gave way to jagged sentences written with a hand that seemed hurried, almost frantic. She leaned closer, her breath shallow, until her eyes caught on a line that stopped her cold. Asterisk, the gold is cursed by greed. It ruins all who claim it. Asterisk, the words sprawled across the page, darker than the notes surrounding them, as if Avery had pressed the pen into the paper with unusual force. The ink had bled through to the next sheet, leaving a ghostly impression. Marissa traced the letters with her fingertip, the edges rough beneath her touch. The phrase echoed in her mind, stark and unyielding. It was not an observation, not a passing thought, but a warning. She flipped back through earlier entries, scanning for context. Avery had written of quarrels among the men, small disagreements that had deepened into mistrust. Harris says the gold belongs more to him than the rest. One passage read. Another described voices raised in anger. Fists slammed onto tables, men accusing one another of hiding their finds. The deeper they dug, the sharper the tension had become, as though the vein itself sowed discord among them. Marissa's eyes returned to the warning, the blunt declaration of ruin. She wondered if Avery had meant it literally, that some superstition had taken root among the miners, or if he had seen greed unravel his companions until all that remained was bitterness. Either way, the message carried across the years with chilling clarity. The gold did not bring salvation, only destruction. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the silence that stretched through the tunnel. The dripping of water echoed faintly, each drop a reminder of time moving on, of the years that had passed since these words were written. She pictured the men, trapped in these same shafts, arguing by lantern light, their voices bouncing off the stone. Perhaps some had stormed away. Others stayed until the mountain itself forced them out. Whatever had happened, Avery's journal was their testimony, and this line was at heart. Opening her eyes again, Marissa studied the walls around her. The symbols etched into stone now seemed darker, heavier, as though they carried the weight of the warning in their grooves. The star, the arrow, the cross. They were not just waypoints. They were reminders of choices made and consequences suffered. She ran her hand across one carving, the rough edge cutting faintly against her skin, and thought about the narrow line between discovery and downfall. Her family's laughter returned to her memory, sharp and dismissive. They had mocked the shack, mocked her stubbornness. To them, any hint of gold would be the only thing that could redeem such a place. Yet here was Avery's voice, preserved in faded ink, telling her that gold was not a gift but a curse. She closed the ledger slowly, pressing it against her knees as though holding it tighter might help her absorb its warning. Still, the pull of the tunnel was undeniable. She stood, lantern lifted, staring into the dark where the rails disappeared. The miners had been undone by their greed, but they had not destroyed the path. The mountain still held its secret, and the ledger still guided her forward. She hesitated, caught between caution and compulsion, her breath rising in the cool air. The warning was clear, yet so was the invitation left in symbols and maps. She whispered the words aloud, the sound of her voice trembling in the hollow space. Asterisk, the gold is cursed by greed. It ruins all who claim it. Asterisk, her voice faded, swallowed by stone, leaving her alone with the echo. The words lingered in her chest as she took a cautious step deeper, the lantern's flame trembling in her grip, the weight of Avery's warning pressing against every beat of her heart. The tunnel narrowed again as Marissa pressed deeper, the rails beneath her boots disappearing intermittently beneath layers of dust and fallen rock. She moved slowly, lantern held high, every step deliberate. The air was cooler here, almost damp, carrying the faint metallic tang that lingered in her throat. She could feel the mountain pressing around her, heavy and silent, the weight of centuries sealed into its stone. Avery's warning echoed in her mind with each footfall, yet curiosity drove her onward. The light of the lantern caught something ahead, a faint glimmer that vanished when she shifted the flame. She froze, heart quickening, and angled the lantern again. There it was, a shimmer along the wall, delicate as a thread, gleaming faintly in the darkness. She stepped closer, breath shallow, until the glow revealed itself clearly. Running across the rock face, snaking through gray stone, was a seam of quartz shot through with flecks of gold. The vein caught the lantern's light and threw it back in tiny flashes, as though the wall itself were studded with stars. Marissa raised the lantern higher, her eyes widening. The vein stretched farther than she could see, vanishing around a curve in the tunnel, its glittering line unbroken. She reached out, pressing her fingers gently against the stone. The quartz was cold and rough under her skin, but the flecks of gold glimmered stubbornly, immune to the centuries that had buried them. She felt a strange thrill stir in her chest. This was no myth. No fading rumor passed from one generation to the next. The miners had been right. The mountain truly did hold gold. She tried to imagine what it must have been like for Avery and his companions to strike this vein for the first time. The swing of a pickaxe, the crack of stone, the sudden glitter in the lantern light. She could almost hear their voices rising, filled with awe and hunger, their hands reaching to touch what seemed like salvation. No wonder greed had taken root among them. To stand before this wall was to face temptation carved into the very bones of the earth. Yet even as wonder coursed through her, Avery's words lingered at the edge of her thoughts. Asterisk, the gold is cursed by greed. It ruins all who claim it. Asterisk, she drew her hand back, staring at the shimmer as though it might bite. The beauty of it was undeniable. But beneath the surface lay something darker, something that had already broken men once before. She crouched, lantern close to the ground, and saw that fragments of the vein had fallen to floor, small shards of quartz still flecked with gold. She picked one up, rolling it between her fingers. It was heavier than it looked, the gold glinting stubbornly even in the weakest light. She slipped it into her pocket without thinking, then paused, her hand lingering there as if she had already crossed some invisible line. The stone seemed to pulse with meaning, both gift and warning. Straightening, she let her gaze follow the vein as it disappeared deeper into shadow. She knew this was only the beginning. If a seam like this could be found here, then somewhere farther along, perhaps in the chambers Avery had hinted at, the vein might widen into something unimaginable. She tightened her grip on the lantern, steadying herself. She was no prospector, no miner, yet she had stumbled onto the very thing that had driven men into madness and ruin. The tunnel stretched on, silent and waiting. Marissa stood before the vein, torn between awe and unease, the flicker of her lantern casting gold back at her from the stone. Above ground, the shack sagged under its condemned notice, dismissed as worthless. But here, beneath its rotting floorboards, lay the truth, wealth enough to have destroyed those who first sought it, and perhaps enough to tempt her if she let it. With a slow breath, she turned her lantern forward and stepped deeper into the tunnel, the glimmer of the vein following her like a thread leading into the mountain's heart. It began with a knock on the door of her apartment, sharp and insistent, the kind that made Marissa's stomach tighten before she even opened it. On the other side stood her cousin Elaine, someone she hadn't seen in years except for fleeting encounters at family gatherings. Elaine's smile was thin, her eyes darting past Marissa into the apartment, as if already assessing what little there was to judge. "I heard about Aunt Ruth's place," Elaine said, her voice coated with false warmth. "Funny how you ended up with it. Must have been quite the surprise." Marissa folded her arms across her chest, blocking the doorway. "It was a surprise," she admitted. Elaine leaned closer, her perfume overpowering in the narrow hall. "Listen, I know the others have been laughing, saying it's not worth a dime, but I don't think that's true. I've been looking into property values up in Clear Creek, and some developers are sniffing around the area. You don't want to get stuck with something you can't fix. Why don't you let me take it off your hands before it becomes a burden?" Marissa felt the old familiar sting of condescension. Elaine wasn't offering to help. She was circling, like a vulture that had caught the scent of something worth claiming. Marissa gave a polite but firm shake of her head. "I'm not selling." Elaine's smile faltered. "Don't be foolish, Marissa. You don't have the money to keep it standing, let alone make it safe. Take what you can now before the county tears it down." I said no. Marissa closed the door gently but firmly, leaving her cousin's protests muffled on the other side. But Elaine was not the last. Over the following week, messages began arriving in her inbox from names she barely recognized. Distant relatives, a second cousin she hadn't spoken to since childhood, all suddenly eager to help her with the inheritance. Some hinted at pooling money together. Others suggested quick sales to save her from the hassle. The tone was always the same. She wasn't capable of handling herself, and she should let someone else take control. Then came the developers. Men in crisp shirts and polished shoes arrived uninvited at the shack itself one afternoon while she was working inside. She heard their voices before she saw them. echoing across the clearing as they laughed at the sight of the crooked roof. When she stepped out onto the porch, their conversation halted, replaced by the smooth, rehearsed tones of salesmen. "We represent a company interested in revitalizing properties like this," one said, handing her a glossy card with a logo stamped in gold. "The land has potential, far more than the structure itself. We'd be willing to make you a generous offer and take the liability off your shoulders." Marissa glanced at the card, then at the men's polished shoes sinking into the weeds. They looked as out of place here as glass towers in the valley. She shook her head. "It's not for sale." The man's smile tightened, the edges brittle. "Think carefully. Places like this are dangerous. Someone could get hurt. You don't want that responsibility, do you?" She felt the threat beneath the courtesy, the unspoken pressure meant to bend her. But the memory of the ledger in her bag and the tunnel beneath her feet hardened her resolve. "I'll manage," she said, and turned back inside, closing the door on their lingering voices. That night, she sat at the old table in the shack, the lantern burning low, her hands still trembling from the encounter. The world above was beginning to stir, people drawn by rumors and possibilities. Yet none of them knew what lay beneath, the truth written in stone and ink. She alone had seen the carvings, the footprints, the first glittering seam of gold. And though the visitors came with smiles and offers, she felt the weight of Avery's warning pressing harder than ever. Greed had ruined those before her. Now it circled again, dressed in family ties and business suits. The representative arrived on a Tuesday morning, driving a black SUV that gleamed unnaturally in the mountain light. Marissa saw the vehicle pull into the clearing while she was stacking broken boards outside the shack. The sight of its tinted windows and polished chrome unsettled her. Nothing about it belonged in this place. When the door opened, a man stepped out in a pressed suit, the sharp lines of his jacket in stark contrast to the crooked roof and leaning porch. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his hair, and approached her with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Miss Turner," he said, extending a hand as if the introduction itself were a transaction. "My name is Gregory Shaw. I represent Meridian Resource Development. I believe you've already been approached by some of our associates, but I've come to make things simple." Marissa wiped her hands on her jeans, but didn't take his. She nodded instead, wary. "This isn't a good time." He smiled, the kind of smile that was polished but hollow, rehearsed to disguise impatience. "I'll only need a moment. You've inherited a property with, let's be frank, limited value. It's condemned. It's a hazard. But the land itself sits on ground of potential interest to our company. We'd like to relieve you of the burden before it becomes more trouble than it's worth." She felt the words as though he were reading from a script. His voice was smooth, but every sentence pressed harder, as if to corner her. "And what exactly would you be offering?" she asked, her tone deliberately even. He reached into a leather folder and drew out a single sheet, holding it with care as though it were a treasure. "We're prepared to offer $25,000 for property, payable immediately upon transfer of deed. No strings attached. That's more than generous. Considering the county will likely demand demolition within weeks. You'll walk away with money in hand. No more worries, no more wasted time." Marissa looked at the paper but didn't take it. $25,000. To someone else it might have sounded like a lifeline, a way out of debt, a step toward stability. To her, it sounded like bait. She thought of the rusted cart still resting on rails, the shimmering seam of gold laced through quartz, the ledger with its coded sketches. 25,000 was not generosity. It was dismissal. "I'm not interested," she said quietly. Shaw blinked, as though the words were foreign to him. "Miss Turner, forgive me, but I don't think you understand the situation. That shack is uninhabitable. The county will fine you, maybe even seize the land if you don't act. Right now you have an opportunity to profit from something that will otherwise sink you. You should think of your future." "I have thought of it," she replied, meeting his gaze. "And my answer is no." For the first time, his polished mask slipped, the corners of his mouth tightening. "Offers like this don't last. Once the county steps in, you'll wish you had taken it." Marissa folded her arms, steady against the weight of his words. "Then I'll deal with it when that happens. Until then, this land stays mine." He studied her for a long moment, as though trying to measure the firmness of her resolve. Then he slid the paper back into his folder, turned without another word, and returned to the SUV. The engine roared to life, the tires spitting gravel as he drove away, leaving the clearing silent once more. Marissa stood where she was, the mountain wind cold against her skin, her heart still beating fast. The offer lingered in her mind not because of its temptation, but because of what it revealed. Others knew, others suspected what lay beneath the shack, or at least believed enough to press her sell. She turned back toward the crooked doorway, the ledger waiting inside. Shaw had come with the confidence of a man who expected to win, but he had left empty-handed. And for the first time, Marissa felt a quiet pride rise within her. She had said no. She had chosen to stand her ground. The calls began the evening after Shaw drove away. Marissa had barely settled at her kitchen table, the ledger open in front of her, when her phone buzzed with Elaine's name flashing across the screen. She let it ring the first time, then the second, but on the third attempt she answered, already bracing herself. "Are you out of your mind?" Elaine's voice was sharp, nearly shrill. "Do you have any idea what you just walked away from? $25,000 cash for that wreck of a shack. Do you think anyone else will ever offer you that again?" Marissa kept her voice calm, though she could feel her pulse quickening. "It's not for sale. You've always been like this," Elaine snapped. "Stubborn, ungrateful. You've been given chance after chance, and you throw them away because you think you know better. Well, you don't. You're broke, Marissa. That money could have helped you pay your debts, maybe even get your life in order for once." Marissa's silence only fueled her cousin's fury. She listened jaw tight, until the call ended abruptly, Elaine hanging up in disgust. But the phone did not stay quiet for long. The next day it was her brother, his tone more measured but no less pressing. "You can't live out there," he told her. "You don't have the money to fix the place, and you sure as hell don't have the skill. This company was offering you a way out, and you turn it down? Why? To play around in the dirt? You think Aunt Ruth left you gold buried under floorboards? You've lost it, Marissa. You're throwing away your only chance." She tried to explain, carefully, cautiously, that there was more to the shack than anyone understood, that the ledgers and carvings weren't just scraps but evidence of something important, something unfinished. But as the words left her mouth, she could hear the disbelief hardening on the other end of the line. Her brother laughed, not kindly but with pity. "Listen to yourself. You sound just like her. Ruth wasted her life in that shack, chasing shadows. And now you're doing the same." The conversations piled up, each one a stone added to the weight pressing on her chest. Distant relatives called with veiled concern, cloaking their greed in tones of care. "We just don't want to see you make the same mistakes Ruth did," one aunt murmured. "She lived alone and bitter, clinging to nothing. Don't you want better for yourself?" Neighbors echoed the same refrain. They all said it differently, but the message never changed. She was a fool for holding on, and sooner or later she would regret it. At night, Marissa sat in the shack with the lantern burning low, listening to the creak of the beams and the whisper of the wind through the broken roof. Their voices echoed in her head, louder than the silence around her. Foolish, stubborn, broken. She traced her fingers over the ledger, over Avery's words written in ink that had outlasted its author. "The gold is cursed by greed. It ruins all who claim it." Those words felt truer now than ever, because greed wasn't just buried in the mountain. It was alive in the voices calling her every hour, demanding she let go. Yet beneath the sting of their accusations, she felt something solid forming. She had stood before the rusted cart, touched the shimmering vein, seen the boot prints left by men who never returned. She knew what lay here was more than money, more than quick profit. The mountain carried a story, and the shack was its keeper. Selling it would mean silencing that story forever. When the phone rang again, she let it buzz unanswered, the sound swallowed by the walls around her. Trust with her family might be collapsing, but down here, in the hollow of the valley, something else was rising, a conviction that she was exactly where she was meant to be, no matter who believed her. The rope still hung from a beam above the opening in the shack's floor, swaying slightly as though it too remembered her hesitation the first time she'd used it. Marissa tightened the strap of the lantern across her shoulder, steadied her breath, and began to climb down once more. The ladder groaned beneath her weight, the rungs spongy with rot. But she moved carefully, hand over hand, until her boots touched the cool ground of the tunnel below. The air was damp and stale, carrying the faint tang of iron, and the silence pressed against her ears. She lifted the lantern and started forward along the rails. The familiar cart sat crooked on its tracks, a sentinel of rust and quartz, its load unchanged. Past it, the tunnel narrowed and bent, until a branching path opened to her left. She had not gone this way before, too shaken by the collapse of trust above ground, too caught in the pull of the vein itself. But tonight, determination carried her. She ducked under a sagging beam and followed the side passage, the lantern spilling its glow across walls scarred by countless strikes of steel against stone. The air here felt heavier, as though it held the breath of men long gone. After several yards, the passage widened into a low chamber supported by thick timbers. The lantern's light revealed objects scattered across the floor, remnants of work abandoned in haste. A rusted saw leaned against the wall, its teeth blackened with age. A wooden crate lay collapsed in the corner, its lid split, but its contents still faintly visible. Tin cups, a handful of bent nails, a hammer with its handle broken. She knelt, brushing away dust, and imagined the miners pausing here to drink, to speak in hushed tones, their laughter echoing faintly against the stone before fading into exhaustion. A scrap of fabric caught her eye, half buried under a pile of rocks. She tugged gently until it came free, the faded threads unraveling in her hand. It was a remnant of a shirt, the collar still intact, buttons rusted to green. She held it carefully, feeling the weight of its story, before folding it into her bag. The ledger had given her words. Now the mountain was giving her touch. Proof of men who had lived and worked here, men whose names had been lost but whose traces endured in the silence. She moved deeper, discovering another chamber carved roughly into the stone. This one carried a different atmosphere. The walls were marked with soot, as if fires had burned here for warmth during long nights. Blackened stones formed a crude ring on the floor, and above it hung an iron hook, once used to suspend pots. Scattered nearby were bones, small, animal, likely the remnants of meals. A tin plate lay dented and cracked, its surface dull by rust. The chamber felt less like a workplace and more like a shelter, a place where men had retreated from the endless swing of pickaxes to rest in the glow of their meager fire. Marissa sat on a rock at the edge of the circle, holding the lantern steady. The silence here felt almost companionable, as though the shadows still carried a memory of voices. She thought of Avery, of the lines in his ledger that spoke of quarrels, of suspicion, of greed sharpening among friends. Perhaps those quarrels had played out in this very chamber. Words traded across the fire's dim glow, until trust fractured and silence replaced it. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the damp air press against her skin, before rising again. Farther still, she discovered a third chamber, smaller than the rest, where the walls bore carvings that had nothing to do with direction or maps. Names had been etched here, rough, uneven letters scratched into stone. She traced them with her fingers. T. Avery Harris, Cole, and another she could not decipher. These were signatures, desperate attempts to leave something of themselves behind in case the mountains swallowed them whole. Seeing them carved so deeply, she felt the echo of Avery's warning all the more keenly. The lantern flickered as she stood, her shadow stretching across the walls. She felt both surrounded and utterly alone, the weight of those lost voices pressing in. The side chambers had revealed fragments of lives, not riches, but she realized that was their treasure, evidence of human endurance carved into stone. She turned back toward the main tunnel, the ledger heavy against her side, knowing the path ahead would only grow darker and more dangerous. But the deeper she went, the more she understood, this inheritance was never meant to be simple. The tunnel narrowed again after the last side chamber, forcing Marissa to stoop as she carried the lantern forward. The air grew colder the deeper she went, the silence broken only by the crunch of her boots against loose gravel and the occasional drip of water echoing somewhere unseen. The rails, though rusted and broken in places, still traced a line ahead like a guide into the mountain's heart. She followed them until the passage bent sharply, and there she stopped short. The lantern's glow revealed not an open tunnel stretching onward, but a wall. At first she thought it was a natural end of the shaft, a point where the miners had abandoned their work. But as she lifted the light higher, her breath caught. The surface before her was not the rough, uneven face of quarried stone. It was deliberate. Stacked blocks fitted tightly together, their edges squared, the seams running in careful alignment. Someone had built this. It was not collapse. It was a barrier. Marissa stepped closer, pressing her free hand against the surface. The blocks were damp, slick with condensation, but they held firm beneath her touch. She leaned in, studying the joins. No mortar, no crumbling seams, just heavy slabs pressed into place with precision. Whoever had sealed this passage had wanted it to stay closed. She lowered the lantern to the ground and crouched, peering at the base. Dust and small stones had gathered against the bottom edge, undisturbed, as though no one had passed this way in more than a century. Her heart beat faster. Avery's ledger had hinted at unfinished work, at a vein lying deeper still, at dangers that had forced him to stop. Was this what he meant? Had the men sealed the tunnel themselves, fearful of collapse? Or had someone come after, walling away something too dangerous or too valuable to leave open? She ran her fingers along the face of the blocks, half expecting to find carvings like the symbols she had followed before. At first there was nothing, only the cold slick of stone. Then, near the right edge at shoulder height, the lantern's light caught faint scratches. She leaned in, squinting. They were shallow, almost erased by time, but unmistakable. An X etched hastily, its lines uneven as though carved in haste or anger. Beneath it, faint words barely visible, asterisk no farther. Asterisk. The warning sent a shiver down her spine. She pulled the ledger from her bag, flipping through the pages until she found a sketch of the branching tunnels. There, drawn at the end of one line, was the same mark, an X larger and darker than any of the others. In the margin Avery had scrawled a note. Asterisk, stone set against stone. Passage closed. Asterisk, she read the words aloud softly, her voice trembling as it echoed back from the walls. Marissa sat back on her heels, staring at the barrier. Beyond it lay whatever Avery and his companions had sought, whatever they had been forced to leave unfinished. Gold, perhaps, or danger too great to endure. The barrier seemed to breathe in the flickering lantern light, its blocks shifting in shadow, as though daring her to try. She pressed her palm against the cold surface once more and felt the full weight of the mountain pressing back. The shack above had been mocked as worthless, a ruin with no future. But here, hidden beneath its sagging floor, lay proof of deliberate intent. Someone had sealed away a secret, not lost to collapse, not buried by chance, but locked behind stone. Marissa lowered her hand, the chill still clinging to her skin, and stepped back. The sealed door was not just an obstacle, it was a message. And though fear pricked at the edges of her thoughts, she knew she would have to find a way beyond it if she wanted to understand why Ruth had chosen her and what story the mountain still guarded. Marissa spent days studying the barrier. Each time she descended, she ran her hands along the seams, pressing her ear against the stone as if the mountain might whisper its secrets. But the wall remained unmoved, its silence absolute. She turned again and again to Avery's ledger, searching for lines she might have overlooked, some instruction hidden between the lists of supplies and warnings. At last, tucked between two entries written weeks apart, she noticed a phrase she had skimmed before without thought. Asterisk, the surface hides what the depth cannot hold. Turn the frame, align with the weight, and the stone will yield. Asterisk, the word snagged in her mind. Cryptic yet deliberate. Turn the frame, align with the weight. That night she sat in the shack above, lantern casting weak light over the warped boards. She let her eyes wander over every detail of the crooked room, searching for something she had missed. The beams still bore the carved symbols she had traced before, but now she studied them with sharper intent. Near the corner, beneath layers of dust, she noticed a thick crossbeam that looked different from the rest. Its grain was smoother, as though it had been worked with greater care. And at its center, nearly lost beneath grime, was a shallow groove in the shape of a circle. Her pulse quickened. She brushed the dust away and felt with her fingertips. The groove was no accident. She set both hands against the beam and pressed. At first, nothing happened. But when she shifted her weight and pushed harder, the wood gave a faint click. She froze, listening. Somewhere beneath her feet, faint and deep, came the sound of stone shifting against stone. Heart racing. She pressed again, this time turning her hands slightly as though twisting a wheel. The beam resisted, then groaned as hidden gears engaged. The floor beneath her trembled, and from below, the unmistakable grinding of stone echoed upward. She dropped to her knees, ear against the floorboards. The sound came from the direction of the sealed tunnel. Marissa scrambled down the ladder, lantern swinging wildly. In the tunnel, the air was filled with faint dust, drifting down from the ceiling as though disturbed by movement. She ran toward the barrier, light dancing against the stone. There, at its base, the seams that had seemed so solid before now showed the slightest shift. A gap no wider than a finger had opened between two of the blocks. She pressed her hand against it and felt the cool draft of air seeping through from the other side. The mechanism in the shack had been no simple quirk of carpentry. It had been designed deliberately, aligned perfectly with the stone door below. The builders had known how to seal the passage not only with brute force, but with engineering. Avery's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, turn the frame, align with the weight, and the stone will yield. Asterisk, the secret was there all along, hidden in the structure above, waiting for someone patient enough to see it. Marissa returned to the shack and worked the beam again, testing how far it would turn, listening to the grinding below. The more she moved it, the wider the seam in the barrier became. Dust fell in heavier sheets, and the sound of rocks shifting thundered faintly upward. But with each adjustment, she felt the danger growing too. The supports groaned, and somewhere deep in the earth, water dripped in steady rhythm, as though reminding her the mountain gave nothing without a price. Still, she could not stop. The shack, mocked as useless, had proved to be the key. Her aunt must have known this, must have preserved the ruin not because she was sentimental, but because she was guarding the entrance to something larger than anyone above suspected. Marissa stood with her hand still pressed against the turning beam, the lantern's light trembling on the walls around her, and understood that she was closer than ever to uncovering what lay beyond the sealed stone. Yet as the weight of the mechanism groaned beneath her palms, she also understood the truth Avery had left behind. Whatever treasure or ruin the miners had found, they had locked it away for a reason. Marissa returned to the tunnel the next day with a tighter coil of rope and a steel pry bar she had borrowed from a hardware store. The air inside felt heavier than before, carrying the faint smell of wet stone. As she descended, each rung of the ladder groaned, and she caught herself listening for new sounds in the dark. Drips, groans, the shifting of unseen weight. She followed the tracks back to the sealed door, her lantern throwing its glow across the uneven stone blocks. The seam she had opened the day before had widened slightly overnight, dust and gravel scattered at its base. A faint breeze slipped through the crack, cool and damp against her skin. She pressed her ear close and heard it clearly now, the rhythmic drip of water beyond the wall. She worked the hidden mechanism above once more, slowly turning the beam until the grinding of stone echoed through the earth. The blocks shifted with a low groan, the seam spreading wider, and at last the gap opened large enough for her lantern's light to spill through. What it revealed chilled her. Beyond the barrier stretched a chamber half-carved, half-natural, its ceiling lined with timber beams blackened by damp. Pools of water shimmered in the glow, rippling with each drop that fell from above. The ground sloped gently downward, and where the rails continued, they disappeared beneath the surface of a shallow flood. She stepped cautiously through the gap, boots sinking into mud, the lantern's reflection doubling in the dark water. The chamber smelled of rot and minerals, a mix of decay and something metallic. She crouched at the edge of the flooded section, dipping her hand briefly into the water. It was icy cold, numbing her fingers instantly. The surface rippled out toward the darkness where the tunnel continued, vanishing beneath the pool. She imagined the miners working here, digging until water began seeping in faster than they could drain it. Perhaps they had fought it for a while, shoring up walls, hauling buckets out until exhaustion set in. But the water must have won. The ledger's words returned to her. Asterisk, supports failing. We cannot continue without risk. Yet the goal runs sure. Asterisk, this must have been where they stopped. forced back by the mountain itself. Rising, she walked along the wall, inspecting the timbers. Many had rotted through at their bases, swollen dark with moisture. Some leaned at precarious angles, one already cracked clean through, held up only by the pressure of the beams beside it. She touched it gently, and it groaned as though warning her. The thought came unbidden. One hard shift, one tremor in the rock, and the ceiling could come down, burying everything beneath mud and stone. She turned the lantern toward the floor and saw faint boot prints hardened in the silt, leading into the water and then vanishing. They looked old, softened by time, but they unsettled her. Whoever had made them had stepped into the flood and never returned this way. Whether they had drowned, turned back through another path, or vanished deeper still, the mountain had erased their ending. Marissa stood at the edge of the water, her reflection trembling in the ripples, the lantern light broken into shards of gold across the surface. Above ground, her family spoke of foolishness, of wasted time. Developers circled, eager to claim what they thought was worthless land. But here, beneath her feet, the truth waited. Gold gleamed in the walls, but water pressed harder, threatening to consume the last of what had been left behind. She could feel it, the fragile balance between revelation and ruin. The chamber was a warning, no less than the words Avery had inked into the ledger. The mountain did not yield without cost. Marissa tightened her grip on the lantern, the cold air prickling against her skin, and stepped back toward the barrier. She would return, but not without a plan. For now, the water would remain master of this place, a reminder that not all treasures lay waiting to be claimed. Some demanded patience, and others, perhaps, were never meant to be touched at all. The day she chose to push beyond the flooded chamber, Marissa carried with her not only the lantern and rope, but also a quiet resolve that felt heavier than either. She had studied Avery's ledger until the words blurred, her eyes returning again and again to the line that hinted at the promise lying deeper. She knew the dangers, the timber sagging with rot, the water pressing against the walls. But something in her refused to turn back. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was a pull of the inheritance itself, a thread that had bound her to the shack and all it concealed. The mechanism in the beam above ground shifted once more with a reluctant groan, and the stone barrier gave way further, the grinding echo carrying through the tunnels. Dust sifted down from the ceiling as the gap widened, enough this time for her to squeeze through fully. The air that met her was colder, sharper, with a metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat. Lantern held high, she stepped into the chamber beyond. The light revealed walls unlike any she had seen before. Where the earlier tunnels had been lined with rough rock and streaks of quartz, here the stone itself gleamed. Veins of gold ran jagged through the walls, thick and unbroken, catching the lantern's glow and throwing it back in muted brilliance. It was not scattered flakes or fleeting glimmers, but long, solid seams, veins that seemed to pulse faintly as if the mountain carried fire in its bones. The sight forced her to stop, breath caught in her chest. She had expected traces, hints at what the miners had chased. She had not expected this. Her boots scraped softly against the floor as she moved deeper, the rails curving into the chamber before stopping abruptly where water had once pooled. Tools lay scattered across the ground as though dropped mid-motion. Picks with their handles split, shovels dull to gray, a wheelbarrow overturned on its side. A lantern much like her own sat rusted in the corner, its glass shattered. She crouched and touched the rim of a bucket still half filled with stone, the rock inside flecked with gold that glimmered even beneath the film of dust. It felt less like a chamber abandoned than one sealed in haste, left exactly as it had been when the men fled. She imagined them here, eyes wide at the sight of the vault, voices rising with triumph and then falling with the weight of dread. They had found what they sought, but they had also found something too large, too dangerous to carry. The water had seeped in, the supports had grown, and they had chosen to leave it behind, burying it in stone rather than risk their lives for what could never be fully taken. Marissa set the lantern on a rock and stood still, letting the silence of the chamber fill her. The gold glowed in the flickering light, unyielding, untouched. She thought of her family, of the mocking voices that told her the shack was worthless. She thought of Shaw and his offer, dressed in politeness but driven by hunger. They had all been blind, yet here was proof that worth could not always be measured in what one could sell. And yet Avery's words clung to her. The gold is cursed by greed. It ruins all who claim it. She reached out and brushed her fingers lightly against one of the veins. The surface was rough but unyielding, cold as ice. It was beautiful, yes, but also immovable, the kind of treasure that could shatter men rather than save them. She withdrew her hand quickly, unsettled by the chill that lingered on her skin. The lantern flickered, and for a moment the chamber seemed alive with light, the walls sparkling as though stars had been buried beneath the mountain. Marissa realized she was the first in more than a century to stand in this vault, the first to see what the miners had left behind. The inheritance Ruth had guarded was not just a shack above, but this, the truth locked away in stone and silence. As she gathered her lantern and turned back toward the narrow gap in the barrier, she felt the weight of choice pressing heavily on her. Gold enough to tempt generations lay behind her, sealed away by men who had understood its danger better than anyone. She carried no pickaxe, no shovel, only the knowledge that she had uncovered the secret. And as much as it awed her, it frightened her more. The vault was silent except for the faint hiss of her lantern and the occasional drip of water from the timbers above. Marissa lingered in the center of the chamber, turning slowly, her light sweeping across the gold-streaked walls. Every seam glittered faintly, catching the flame like stars buried in stone. But as her eyes adjusted, she began to notice something else beneath the shimmer. Markings carved deep into the rock, more deliberate than the pick scars left from mining. She drew closer, lantern raised. The first mark revealed itself clearly, a circle bisected by a vertical line, etched firmly into the stone above one of the thicker veins. It was not random. The carving was steady, purposeful, cut with care. She ran her fingers over it, the groove sharp even after decades of damp and neglect. A memory stirred in her mind. She had seen this before, not in the carvings on the shack beams, but in the margins of Avery's ledger. On one page, beside his notes about sealing the passage, he had drawn the same symbol. She had thought it little more than idle doodling. Now it stood before her, carved into the very wall of the vault. Her heart quickened. She moved the lantern across the chamber, searching. More symbols appeared, some simple, others intricate. Triangles interlocked within circles, a cross with uneven arms, and most striking, a handprint etched into the rock with fingers splayed, as though someone had pressed their palm there and traced it. These were not the private marks of miners, leaving their initials. These were emblems, a language of symbols left by a group that had worked in secrecy. She pulled the ledger from her bag, flipping quickly through the fragile pages until she found the entry she sought. There, Avery's handwriting leaned darker, his words hurried. Asterisk, the mark of those who keep what cannot be lost. They watch, they preserve, and we have joined them in pact. This mine is no longer ours alone. Asterisk Marissa read the words twice, the weight of them pressing into her chest. Avery and her companions had not been working in isolation. They had been tied to something larger, a network or brotherhood that believed in keeping such discoveries hidden from the world above. The name came to her from family whispers she had heard as a child, stories she had dismissed then as fables. The Preservation Brotherhood. Men who, according to rumor, concealed treasures of history, hiding them away when the world threatened to consume them with greed. Some said they were protectors, others called them hoarders, but all agreed their work left scars and mysteries scattered across the land. She stepped back, lantern light trembling against the walls, and studied the chamber anew. This was no simple mine abandoned by tired men. The ceiling of the stone door, the mechanism hidden in the shack, the carved marks, they all pointed to deliberate preservation. Her Aunt Ruth must have known at least part of it, choosing to protect the shack not out of stubbornness, but as a guardian of what lay beneath. The realization unsettled Marissa. The Brotherhood's reach was said to extend across decades, perhaps centuries. If this vault was theirs, or if Avery and his partners had sworn themselves to it, then she had inherited something far heavier than property. She had stepped into a secret she was never meant to uncover, one her family could not begin to imagine. She touched the handprint carved into the stone, her fingers fitting awkwardly into its grooves, and felt a chill ripple through her. These men had believed they were preserving more than wealth. They believed they were guarding a legacy too dangerous to be exposed. And now she stood inside it, lantern flickering, caught between awe and dread. The gold glittered all around her, promising riches beyond measure. But the marks told a different story, one of oaths and warnings, of choices that bound lives long after miners themselves had vanished. Marissa lowered the lantern, her shadow stretching across the chamber wall. She had thought she was inheriting a ruin. In truth, she had inherited a responsibility. The first sign that trouble had followed her came not underground, but on the road leading up to the shack. Marissa had driven out with the early morning light, her mind still heavy with the symbols she had seen etched into the stone vault. She had hoped for quiet, time to think. But when she turned the last bend, the clearing was no longer hers alone. 2 trucks sat idling near the tree line, their doors open, voices carrying through the crisp air. She slowed, heart tightening. A cluster of figures stood near the shack, her cousin Elaine among them, and 3 men she recognized by their crisp suits and leather shoes. Developers. Elaine spotted her first, raising a hand not in greeting but in command. "Marissa," she called out as Marissa stepped from the car. "We've been waiting. It's time you listen to reason." The men flanking her offered rehearsed smiles, each one strained with impatience. One stepped forward, introducing himself as Shaw again, his voice smooth but sharp at the edges. "We understand you refused earlier offers. That's your right. But circumstances have changed. Your family has expressed concern, and frankly, the county's patience is running thin. This property is unsafe. It's best for everyone if you let us take it." Marissa felt every eye on her. Her cousin's look was full of contempt, the men's of calculation. She held her ground, arms folded. "The land isn't for sale." Elaine scoffed. "You're delusional. You think this broken shack is some kind of treasure? You've lost touch with reality. We're trying to save you from yourself." One of the developers stepped in, waving a folder thick with papers. "The county inspector will be filing formal action soon. Condemned structures can and will be seized. You could be fined, even face liability if someone gets hurt. We're offering you a way out. Pennies on the dollar, yes, but at least it's something. Otherwise, you'll lose everything." The words pressed against her like a wall, each one carefully chosen to box her in. She glanced toward the shack, the crooked roofline standing stubbornly against the sky. Beneath it, the vault waited, its veins of gold glimmering in the dark. None of them knew what lay beneath. None of them understood the weight of the marks, the warning written in Avery's hand. They saw only profit and liability. Her voice was steady when she answered, "I'm not selling. Not to you, not anyone. This land is mine, and I'll deal with the county if I have to." The men exchanged looks, their polished composure cracking slightly. Elaine's face flushed with anger. "Do you hear yourself? You're clinging to a ruin while real opportunities slip away. Aunt Ruth was mad to waste her life here, and now you're following her down the same path. You're dragging the family name through the mud." Marissa's jaw tightened. "No, what I'm doing is honoring what she left me. You don't have to understand it, but you don't get to take it either." For a long moment, the clearing was filled only with the sound of the idling trucks. The men shifted, clearly unaccustomed to being refused. Elaine turned away with a sharp laugh, muttering something about lawyers and court filings. Shaw slid the folder back into his case, his smile gone cold. "We'll see how long you can hold out," he said quietly, before motioning to the others. They left with the same confidence they had arrived with, engines growling as they disappeared down the road. Elaine lingered last, her glare burning across the distance. "You'll regret this," she said flatly, before climbing into one of the trucks. Marissa stood alone once more, the shack at her back, the air heavy with silence after their departure. She knew they would return, not just with threats but with papers, with law on their side. But beneath her feet, deeper than their reach, lay the truth she could not ignore. The confrontation had only confirmed what Avery had warned. Greed circled like wolves, waiting for weakness. She turned to the shack, the lantern inside already waiting, and felt her resolve settle like stone. This was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about guarding what the mountain had kept hidden, even if it meant standing against her own family. Marissa knew the confrontation would not be the end. The looks on their faces, the certainty in their voices, told her they would be back. This time armed not just with words, but with legal papers. If she was to stand her ground, she needed more than stubbornness. She needed proof, something solid to tie her inheritance not only to the shack, but to the vault below. She began by returning to the lockbox, the one she had first pried from beneath the floorboards. She had only skimmed its content before, but now she sifted through each brittle sheet with careful hands. Among the supply lists and journals, she found folded documents marked with dates and seals. One bore the county stamp from 1891, recording a claim registered under the name of Thomas Avery. Another, written years later in careful script, transferred stewardship of the property to a man named Harris Cole. At the bottom of the page was a line in faded ink, asterisk, to be maintained in trust by heirs or appointed keepers, not for sale or surrender, but to preserve what is within. Asterisk. The word struck her like a spark in the dark. This was no ordinary deed. It was a statement of intent, binding the land not as a simple property, but as a trust, a stewardship meant to be honored and continued. The names that followed on later documents matched those she had seen carved into chamber walls. Cole, Harris, even Avery himself. They had not only mined here, they had sworn to preserve it. Digging deeper into the papers, she found a smaller notebook bound in leather, its cover cracked with age. Inside, the handwriting shifted from the practical tone of a ledger to something more formal. It read almost like a charter, outlining agreements between the men who had first cut into the mountain. They described themselves as brothers in preservation, writing that the wealth of the mine was not to be squandered or divided, but kept hidden against the ruin that unchecked greed would bring. They wrote of guarding not only gold but history, of keeping records safe for those chosen to follow. The final entries were in a hand she recognized at once, her Aunt Ruth's. The ink was faded but legible, her words steady and unembellished. "I have kept the shack though all others mocked it," she had written. "They see only ruin, but this place is more than boards and stone. The trust remains with me, as it remained with those before. To Marissa I leave this burden, for she is the only one who listens to silence as I have. She will know that stewardship is not ownership, and that what lies beneath is not for taking but for keeping." Marissa's hands trembled as she closed the notebook. It was not only a record of past agreements. It was a chain of intention stretching from the miners to Ruth and now to her. She was not simply an inheritor of land. She had been named a steward, entrusted with guarding something larger than wealth. That evening she spread the documents across the old table in the shack, lantern light washing over seals and signatures. Anyone could see this was more than rumor. The county might call the shack condemned, her family might call her foolish, but the papers carried the weight of history and law alike. If the developers pressed their case, she now held the proof to fight back. As the lantern flickered, Marissa sat with the knowledge pressing against her chest. She had been chosen not to profit, but to preserve. The Brotherhood's mark carved into stone, the deeds written in careful hands, Ruth's final words, all pointed to the same truth. She was the rightful steward of the mine, and no amount of pressure from family or developers could strip her of that responsibility. The shack creaked softly in the night wind, its broken boards sighing as though they too carried a memory of what had been hidden all along. Marissa sat inside at the crooked table, the paper spread before her, lantern flame burning low. The air smelled of dust and old timber, but to her it no longer felt suffocating. It felt alive, almost reverent, as though the place itself had been waiting for this moment of recognition. For weeks she had carried the weight of mockery, of offers made with smirks, of relatives who saw her as a fool clinging to rot. Now the truth lay in her hands. The mine beneath her feet was real, its veins of gold glittering in the dark. The vault had been carved deliberately, sealed deliberately, preserved not for profit but for posterity. And through the journals, the deeds, and the carvings, she had learned what no one else could see, that the shack, derided as worthless, was the very key to all of it. The sagging roof, the broken windows, the condemned notice nailed with finality, those had been the camouflage. What appeared to be ruin was, in truth, a gatekeeper. She thought of Avery, carving his warnings into stone, pressing words into paper that would outlive him. She thought of the men who had abandoned their tools mid-strike, walking away from riches because they understood what greed could do. She thought of Ruth, her aunt who had endured years of ridicule, guarding this place without ever speaking of it, leaving the trust in silence. They had all chosen preservation over surrender, stewardship over gain, and now, improbably, that responsibility had passed to her. Marissa leaned back, the lantern's glow reflecting in her tired eyes. She realized the inheritance had never been about gold. The mine might tempt others, but what Ruth had passed down was not or quartz. It was endurance, the courage to hold on when the world laughed, to listen when the silence carried more truth than any voice. That was what her relatives could not understand, what developers in their suits could not calculate. Value was not always measured in dollars. Sometimes it was measured in resilience, in the strength to carry forward a promise made long before her time. Outside, the night was still. The mountains loomed in shadow, silent witnesses to the generations who had lived and labored here. Marissa rose and stepped onto the leaning porch, the boards creaking under her weight. The shack looked fragile in the starlight, but she knew better now. Fragile things did not stand for over a century against storms, fire, and neglect. Fragile things did not conceal mechanisms tied to stone doors or guard vaults lined with gold. The shack had survived because it had a purpose, and because someone in each generation had chosen to protect it rather than abandon it. She closed her eyes and let the cool air wash over her. For the first time since inheriting the place, she felt no doubt. The true inheritance was not wealth, but the trust itself, the understanding that she was part of something larger than herself, something that demanded both courage and restraint. Her family might never forgive her choice, the developers might never relent, but she no longer needed their approval. She had seen the truth carved into beams and stone. Preservation was not weakness. It was strength disguised as silence. When she opened her eyes again, the shack seemed different. Not condemned, not ruined, but steadfast. A guardian. She touched the worn railing gently, almost as if thanking it. What she carried now was not a burden, but a legacy, one she would honor even if the rest of the world dismissed her. Inheriting gold would have been easy. Inheriting faith in endurance, in memory, in the quiet courage to stand alone, was harder, but infinitely more valuable. And it was hers.